It's been a week since the release of CYNO on the Genshin Impact live server, so it's finally time to talk about the meta perspective of these characters. Is CYNO a good meta character? How is his meta strength, meta position, and is he worth pulling from a meta point of perspective? Now, even though it's only been a short week, I think a lot of people already made up their mind about him, like if you're gonna pull for him or not. To be very honest, CYNO is an okay pull. If you like him, then he could be a pretty good pull for your account, provided that you do like the characters and you want to play the characters. But if you don't like him that much, then you could totally skip him. He's definitely not the next overpowered characters that you have to pull for. In fact, he's probably far from that. But for those of you who are still deciding or on the edge, then this video could be for you. And even if you have already pulled it for him, or you made up your mind that you weren't gonna pull him anyway, then there might still be surprise in this video. So let's get started. And as always, just before we start, if you're not subscribed to the channel already, then don't forget to do so, and let's get started. As a on-field Electro DPS, CYNO does have a fair amount of problems, such as long field time or being very vulnerable, that we kind of cover in the first impression video of CYNO. Now, those of the thing remain pretty much the same, but the thing that especially stood out is that CYNO can actually be fit into multiple unique different teams in Genshin Impact, but not because he's flexible, but rather because he just doesn't really have any great teammate that can be paired with him. And as a result, it doesn't really matter who you bring with CYNO or what team you put into CYNO with, it is going to perform relatively okay and the same. So it's more like a drawback rather than an upside, especially with the Dandro slot currently only having Collie and Dandro Traveler, which is not the greatest. Overall, those definitely limit CYNO's meta values at the current moment. It could go up in the futures as we get more and more support that are made tailored for Dandro or like Dandro Archon. But as always, I don't advise pulling for future potential as it's highly dangerous. So at the current moment, unfortunately, one of the biggest problems of CYNO in the Genshin Impact meta is just that he doesn't really work well with that many characters. There are some teams that CYNO are suitable in. The first one is what I like to call a whatever team. The second one is the aggravate team, which is the most common rand team. And finally, a quickened hyperbloom team, which I'll slowly explain in the later half of the video. Starting off with the whatever, as CYNO doesn't have any particularly good synergies with any of the supporting characters in Genshin Impact, one of the best options that you can actually do with CYNO is to just put good individual characters into your team so that they can just dish out a bunch of raw damage. One is primary example, as much as the joke it is, would be CYNO National, which actually does work really well and can do a bunch of damage. Not particularly because of CYNO, but because you just have individually really good characters that can do a lot of damage. And in this place here, CYNO actually does have some synergy with the national team, as he provide electros for channeling to do overload, which can cause a lot of additional single target damage, similar to how Raiden National basically function. In the first impression video, if you remember, one of the teams that I really liked was the CYNO Taser team for a similar reason, where you just have good individual unit like Xingqiu's, Castle, and Beidou, and just rely on raw damage rather than the synergies for CYNO to do reaction to kind of brute force your way through the Abyss or the Genshin Impact endgame. Interestingly enough, that Chinese Fury Crafter have the same idea, except they prefer to run Yalon instead of Castle here, which do a double Hydra with double Electro setup. And again, it's pretty much the same concept. You do really good individual characters, maybe with a little bit of synergies where Yalon can actually give the A4 damage bonus passive to CYNO so that he can do better on-field damage. But in general, these are called, or I like to call them, the whatever team, since you're not particularly looking for synergies between the characters, but rather just to put good individual characters in and just rely on like raw damage. Even though these teams work extremely well, the problem with CYNO being in this team, as well as the Genshin Impact meta, is that you're not really putting CYNO into this team because he has incredible synergies with the rest of the characters. In fact, again, it is completely the opposite. Since CYNO doesn't have good synergies with the entire Genshin Impact rosters anyway, you might as well just forego synergies and just put good unit into your team in hope to create something. And once again, National Core, Taser Core, Double Hydro Core, and those are the real reason why these teams are strong, not particularly because of CYNO. And very often, if we were to compare it to a different potential character that you can put in, sometimes these teams are better utilized by other characters that have actual synergies with the rest of the party. For example, instead of putting CYNO here, we can of course put the other Electro character in Raiden to create Raiden National, which would be significantly better than doing CYNO National. It both work, they both do really good amount of damage, but as CYNO doesn't have synergy with the National Core, where Raiden does have really good synergy with the National Core, Raiden definitely take the lead here. And the same pretty much go for other team in this whatever team category, where for example, putting in Hydro unit like Xingqiu's with CYNO can get really good performance. The truth here is that you're not utilizing the Hydro application that Xingqiu's are bringing or Yalon are bringing, and therefore it kind of feel like a waste in the Genshin Impact meta, where for example you can be using a different character that would much prefer the Hydro application and therefore create tight synergies, like Hu Tao, who can use the Hydro to vaporize, or Ayaka, who can use the Hydro to create freeze. The biggest upside about these teams is that you are not forcing yourself to put a bad unit in for the reason of synergies, which is the case of Danjo, as again, we don't have good Danjo characters in the current moment. But the other particularly important reason is that kind of solve one of the biggest problem with CYNO, and that is he's really vulnerable and squishy. For example, when it comes to the Taser core, you can bring Beidou and Xingqius in as your defensive option without giving up a lot of offensive power, which is one of the major problems that his other team might have. Likewise, the National core by default come with Bennett, who is not only one of the strongest healer in the game, but he also is able to provide massive offensive power at the same time. And therefore, you don't really feel like you're losing out a lot of offensive power by forcing yourself to bring a defensive option, as these teams by default come with a offensive option that conveniently is also your defensive option. And that's one of the huge reasons why CYNO National is honestly a really good team. It's because the inclusion of Bennett just make your CYNO so much less vulnerable that it might even just be the more comfortable team to run. With that being said, let's move on to Aggravate CYNO, which might have been his intended main major playstyles, but it's not necessarily the greatest one either. The problem with Aggravate CYNO is that it started introducing all of those problems that we were mentioning in the early half of this video, or even back in the first impression video. CYNO has long field time, CYNO is rather vulnerable and squishies and stuff, or Danjo character just kind of sucks at the current moment. To be very honest, overall CYNO is actually quite dependent on having Zhongli as one of his teammates, as he's just that vulnerable to damage, and therefore having the massive defensive option from Zhongli really help. Unfortunately, that often come at a cost of great offensive power, especially being showcased in the Aggravate team, which while have fine performance, to be honest, could argue to be not as good as Keqing, which is the unfortunate truth. There is honestly two major reasons why CYNO is not necessarily as good as Keqing in the Aggravate team setup. The first one is because Keqing have so much shorter rotation time with her 12-second elemental burst and a very spammable elemental skills. It makes Keqing dramatically less dependent on a healer, and therefore she can bring Kaze, which can massively increase your offensive power in Aggravate team, as you can increase your electro damage bonus, and then most importantly, Kaze can bring the VV4 set, which reduce electro resistance by 40%, in addition to the fact that Kaze himself can trigger Aggravate thanks to doing electro infusion. The loss of Kaze in a CYNO team, because you have to bring Zhongli, would result in dramatic damage decrease that honestly arguably might not be worth it depending on your playstyles and your account. But the most important is that with Keqing having a shorter rotation, it's just significantly easier to maintain your overall uptime when it comes to your entire team, including your officials deployables, your Kaze buff, or your Danjo main characters, Danjo's elemental applications, or even just energy recharge in general, as it allows you to cast skills more often, therefore generating more energy, therefore they're lowering your energy requirement. One of these problems can actually be seen in practical gameplay as well, where you might be able to observe that CYNO is more dependent on Danjo's Traveler's elemental burst than Keqing is, and the problem is that means that if your enemy somehow walked out of the circle, or maybe the enemy spawned on the other side of the chamber, then they might not be in the Danjo's Traveler elemental burst, and therefore you'll be losing your Aggravate uptime on CYNO, which would be terrible for your damage. On the other hand, while you can argue that Keqing have similar problem, since Keqing have a shorter rotation time, it is much easier to recast the elemental skill on your Danjo Traveler and therefore apply Danjo that way. For example, let's say the enemy is on the other side of the room, you can just switch to your Danjo Travelers, apply elemental skill, and then switch back to Keqing to do some elemental skill or elemental burst. On CYNO, that is significantly harder to do because your elemental burst just dominate majority of your field time. In addition, you have to think about stuff like energy cost. Should you go into your elemental burst right now? Do you have enough uptime to justify going into your burst? And overall, Keqing is just much smoother to run than CYNO, especially since you can also run Zhongli with Keqing if you really desire to. If you compare CYNO team with Zhongli versus Keqing team with Zhongli though, then that gap do close much closer, and it's more reasonable to call CYNO a Keqing side grade rather than a Keqing downgrade in this team, because well, you don't get the additional benefit of being able to bring Kaze with Keqing anymore. I believe Keqing actually still lead ahead thanks to better utilization of officials in here, but I think it's close enough to say CYNO is a Keqing side grade at best in Aggravate aggravate team, and if you do run the healerless version of the Genshin aggravate team, namely with Kazuya, then it is unfortunately a pretty massive significant damage drop. With that being said, there's actually still hope. One of the team that actually end up leading and often better than the other team like aggravate team with CYNO is actually the Quicken Bloom team, which is specifically ran with CYNO, Yelan, the Angel main characters, and then either Diano or Zhongli. But let me slowly explain what this team do and how does this team work and why it is strong. This team utilizes the fact that CYNO can trigger both Quicken as well as hyperbloom very reliably to benefit from the fact that he can utilize elemental mastery really well. In this team, even though you have a Hydro characters, Yelan doesn't apply enough Hydro to consistently overtake the Danjo reaction, and as a result, you can actually have a 70% quicken uptime on CYNO in addition to creating a bunch of seed. And then CYNO can easily trigger those seed to create hyperbloom, which means that CYNO is consistently being the trigger of quicken as well as hyperbloom on himself. In addition to Yelan just being a really good individual character that can do a lot of damage, her A4 passive here can actually dramatically benefit CYNO to give him a lot more damage and overall just work really well and have one of the highest damage potential of many teams. Main problem here is that, well, a lot of these characters are energy hungry as you're running 4 different elements in your party, in addition to the fact that it has a very tight rotation and you can't really mess it up. It is really difficult to play. You have to not only hit your elemental skill on time with the eye, but preferably you have to make sure that to not mess up so that your elemental skill can be triggering on the aggravate proc as well. Overall, it is definitely a very tight team to play, which is conveniently why Zhongli is in here, which dramatically reduces the difficulty to play the team and also conveniently shredding both Hydro and Electro resistance with the 20% universal shred. The owner here is the possible replacement. In this case, it does give you a little bit more consistent reaction time as it utilizes a different reaction called Fridge. In this case, the Cryo kind of prevent your Hydro from overtaking too much and therefore allow you to maintain better reaction uptime, but Zhongli is preferred, Diano is runnable. Unfortunately, Xingqiu's doesn't work that well in this position because, well, Xingqiu just happened to apply a little too much Hydro for this to actually work. Interestingly enough, Yelan apply exactly enough Hydro to get a lot of seed and do a lot of hyper bloom, but not enough for it to actually overtake the quicken aura that much. And so unfortunately, there's only one iteration of this team right now, and it does make it a very expensive team to run, in addition to the fact that some people might just have better use case for Yelan, for example, like going back to double Hydros. And I would say it's overall a really strong team and it's a really solid team, but it's very difficult to play and it's very expensive to draft in terms of unit utility as well as just the overall team drafting process, as it does require 3 limited 5-star characters, and so might not be suitable for everyone. Overall, I think CYNO have pretty decent performing team. They are pretty fair. He has a lot of team and they all work fine. The main problem is, of course, that CYNO is rather restrictive right now. He has a lot of individual problem and none of his team are really heavily meta when it compared to a different, more suitable 5-star characters. For example, like Raiden in national team or Keqing in aggravate team. Because of that, while he's mid-tier, at first I kind of wanted to deduct point for that, but in the end I decided that he can be a free, so I'm gonna give him a 3 out of 5 for meta pool value, which means, as I mentioned in the intro, you can pull for him. If you do like him, he'll work fine, he'll function well, but if you don't like him, if you don't care about him, you just rather play other electro characters, then definitely skip him. He isn't that important to pull for. I would say that his Quicken Bloom play styles is interesting though, and CYNO might get better in the futures as we get a better teammate for him, especially new Danjo characters like Danjo Archon. But as always, I highly recommend that you don't pull based off future potential, as nobody can really tell the futures. We don't even know what Danjo Archon does. We don't know if Danjo Archon is gonna work well. Maybe Danjo Archon will have a different solution or a different problem when it comes down to the comparison between her and the existing Danjo characters. Maybe Danjo Archon can move her ability, or maybe the ability have really large radius so that the problem of Danjo main characters burst staying in one spot doesn't happen. We will never know. We don't really know. So again, I highly advise that you don't pull based off future potential, but just rather stick to what we know right now. And the unfortunate news is that CYNO is rather mid, and he's a good mid-tier character, just like other mid-tier characters like Ethos, but he isn't like particularly meta changing. He isn't like really strong. On the bright side, at least he's not weak. But yeah, that's pretty much it for CYNO after a week, and here is his current meta value after a week being in the Genshin Impact live servers. And again, overall, to summarize, he is quite mid, has some problem, not the biggest but not the smallest either. With that being said, a lot of you probably made up your your mind about CYNO already, but for those of you who are still on the edge about CYNO, hopefully this video can help you out. And if it did help you out, or maybe it didn't and you're just interested in it, then as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.